In the interwar years, the task had been to maintain real economic activity and employment at some predetermined full employment level, SWF, 98. Keynes had regarded monetary and fiscal expansion as the way out of the underemployment trap. Meade, like his fellow Keynesians, had believed that a nation could and should spend itself into internal balance. By the early 1950s, Meade had become convinced that prices and not quantities were the more immediate cause for concern. In the new economic environment, what was required was not a reflation but a reduction in total demand. In an overheated economy, what was needed was not the accelerator but the brakes. By the late 1950s, the emphasis was to change against CPI 385, 398. Unemployment in Britain had ranged between 1% and 3% in the 1950s. The rate of inflation lay between 0.6 and 4.9% except in the outlier 1951-1952 when it exceeded 9%. In 1984 the rate of unemployment was 12.5% and the rate of inflation 5%. Unemployment had gone up. Inflation had not gone down. It was inflation combined with unemployment. It was stagflation. It was a nasty economic animal, SWF, 1. Copyright the authors 2018-167D. Reisman, James Edward Meade, Great Thinkers in Economics, Web links. Stagflation, Meade said in 1978, had emerged, relatively recently, CPI, 363. It had stood the old Keynesianism on its head. Stagflation was the ultimate horror to anyone brought up in the Keynesian tradition, SWF, 4. Not only was it impossible to ensure sustained full employment, but it was just as impossible to eliminate the upward displacement in the price associated with any given level of joblessness. As Weitzman says, stagflation is an especially difficult disease to cure because the macroeconomic treatment for one symptom of the malady aggravates the other. Weitzman 1984, 2. All market economies, Meade declared, were experiencing the same upward drift. Britain, however, was in the worst shape of all. CPI, 402. Britain, Meade said in 1975, was near the edge of the precipice, CPI, 365. The precipice lent urgency to the 4 volumes of his Principles between 1965 and 1976, to his 2 volumes on stagflation in 1982 and 1984 and to his Full Employment Regained, published in 1995, the year of his death. The question mark in the title was a part of the message. Once internal balance had come to mean both employment and prices, Meade was not certain that a satisfactory joint product would ever be delivered. It was an ugly state of affairs. DM 3. 8.1 Cost push demand pull is no match for high interest rates and cuts in public spending. Stagflation is, however, the new reality that Keynes did not chart. Rising prices often signal that demand is excessive. Slack and waste might suggest that it is deficient. The old Keynesians could not explain the too much that coexisted cheek by jowl with the too little. Meade was the revisionist who brought the macroeconomics of the 1930s into line with the new reality of supply-side cost push. Already in 1957 he was saying that it had to be done. The problem of control of inflation from the cost side as well as the demand side is perhaps the most important economic issue which now faces the governments of Europe. CP3, 225. In Britain, due to a much stronger monopolistic union organization, the atmosphere of extreme confrontation and conflict in industrial relations CPI, 402, was especially serious. Corporations charge administered prices. Cartels restrict supply to corner all that the traffic will bear. In Meade's time there was OPEC and there was the Sugar Agreement. Marshall and even Smith had written about imperfect competition. Non-competitive gouging was not new. Nor was legislation to challenge the restrictive practices. Imperfect competition is Marx's monopoly capital. Yet it is also the belligerent and exploitative union movement which seizes a surplus to which it has no right. Meade was concerned about the growth of trade unions with concentrated power which were strong-arming their capitalists for an unearned reward. It is all in Marshall. Marshall was opposed to the class selfishness of aggressive and redistributionist union leaders who were seeking supernormal remuneration in their own narrow markets. I want these people beaten at all costs. Marshall 1925, 400. Unions were countervailing power. They must not become a new locus of original power that redistributes income because winter feels cold without fuel. Meade, like Marshall, could see no case for big labor. Like big business, it was holding the community to ransom. Both the bullying unions and the leaderly corporations were a departure from the equity and efficiency of the self-stabilizing market benchmark. In the case of the unions there was something more. Not only were the imperfect competitors getting the microeconomics wrong, they were causing a macroeconomic failing. Union cost push was at the root of a continuing rise in the general price index that was Cox and box with an unacceptable level of unemployment. Already in 1946 Meade was expressing his concern about the new virus that was on the cusp of an epidemic. Trade union policy is the crux of the whole matter. Letter from Meade to D. H. Robertson dated 7 April 1946, MP 3/6. He wanted those people beaten. The ideal for Meade is supply and demand, flexible parameters and an omniscient auctioneer. The rate for the job should be whatever emerges from any bargain freely struck between employers and employees. SWF 158. The reality is not freedom but uncontrolled power, exercised in a lunatic way. CPI 365, 369. It is a monopoly which, like any other monopoly, will often promote its own sectional interest at the cost of the rest of the community. ppm 68. The reality is not the public but the private interest. Meade wanted those people beaten. It is essential that all forms of restrictive practice among wage earners should disappear. CP2, 293. Unions perpetuate a confrontational mindset inherited from the dark, satanic sweatshops of the past. In the Dickensian 19th century the factory owners had power and the shop floor supplicants did not. In order to redress the balance the lumps of labor banded together to bargain collectively with the moneyed elite. Uppermost was pay but there was also a common stake in hours, unfair dismissals, individual grievances, health and safety at work. Historically and functionally, the felt need for mutual aid provides the basic economic justification for trade union organization. SWF 48. The mobility of manpower is always limited by housing tenures, skill sets and non-rational sentiment. The alternative to the reserve army is to enter into cartels that will fight for their rights. Unions preserve the economic balance of power. Yet there is something more. A social democrat and a cooperator, the morally minded Meade assigned to the market for labor a subjective meaning which differentiated it qualitatively from the mundane market for pins. People are a commodity. They are also a living, breathing commodity. The market for labor is the pulse even as it is the marginal product. Meade saw the privileges and immunities granted to the mutual aid associations in the 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution as a reversion to the communal integration that Tönnies called Gemeinschaft. Tönnies 2001, 1887-52. Self-help groups were a rejection of dog-eat-dog. Meade welcomed the unions because they represent a movement from contract towards status or property rights in the field of employment law SWF 66. It is a surprising concession for a market liberal to make. Meade is contending that the employee has something approaching an implicit title to the workplace where he spends so much of his life. Implicit in the employment contract is the invisible promise of affectual fraternalism and intrinsic motivation. The union is the implicit guarantor of the implicit claim. It is a focus for the human need to belong. It is all in Marshall. While some unions are not afraid to dominate and abuse, Alfred Marshall, declaring that, "I am wholly a trade unionist of the old stamp," stated that most were inculcating in their members the high values of forbearance, consultation and honesty. TUs are a greater glory to England than her wealth. Marshall 1925, 398, 400. Marshall saw the unions not so much as a seedbed for dissension but as a school for Democrats. He believed that the unions educate their members in the rights and duties of citizenship. They were intermediate bodies which socialized the individual into the whole. Meade followed Marshall. It is the schizophrenic mix of status and contract, affirmation and exchange. Unions, like other clubs, accustom their members to other regarding conduct. Common conditions channel their passions. The unions, in pressing for disclosure and consultation as well as the naked quid pro quo, are acknowledging the ethical distinction between the pin peddler and the supplier of human essence. Man is a social animal. Workers are not pins. Meade, like Marshall, was on the side of the unions. Collusion rights an existing wrong. Yet he also believed that the redistribution of power had gone too far. Universal suffrage, union-sponsored politics and left-of-center legislation had shifted the balance from social egalitarians to militant toughs employing the methods of unarmed guerrilla warfare, SWF 31, to force through pay rises in excess of improvements in productivity. It is not one union but all unions that are pushing for pay at an artificially high level, CPI 333. The incidence of the quasi-tax they impose falls on prices when firms pass on the cost and on jobs which denies the out-of-work a decent foothold on the ladder. The result is preventable inflation in tandem with unnecessary unemployment. It is stagflation. It is a nasty economic animal. 8.2 Restoring the Balance. Meade in 1948 spelled out the choices. They were stagnation, starvation, slavery and seduction, ppm. 72. Stagnation was wasteful underemployment because of inappropriate pricing. Starvation was the descent into the mass unemployment of the 1930s. Slavery was Stalin's command economy. Seduction was supply and demand. Of the four, only supply and demand would ensure an optimal package of consensus and prosperity, full employment and stable prices. The free market knows the way. It grinds out an equilibrium in which workers offer their services at a low enough real price for employers to employ them. There. 7. If there were perfectly competitive conditions in the labor market, the critical unemployment percentage would be greatly lowered. CE 374. It is the same assertion that was repeatedly being made by the pre-Keynesian classicals when they accused the unemployed of holding out stubbornly for an unrealistic rate of pay. If wage rates were perfectly plastic, this implies the possibility of negative rates. There would be no unemployment. Pigou 1927, 183. The free market is the answer. It is essential that the price mechanism should work in the labor market. ppm. 69. Unions which veil more power than they counter are the problem. Unless wage fixing, unquestionably antisocial, is taken away from the narrow-minded and the sectional, the public interest will not be secure. it will be impossible to maintain full employment without an inflationary upward movement of money wages, money costs, and money prices ppm, 69 to 70. It will be stagflation. Looking forward from 1948, Meade could already see the face of what was to come. Meade's criticism is being directed not at the unions per se but at the excessive monopolistic positions SWF 93 of the militant apex. An irresponsible leadership is making excessive claims which, by pushing up prices and creating unemployment, are in effect unleashing Piggovian diswelfares that damage the economic interests of other parties SWF 72. Innocent bystanders are bearing the cost. It is not fair. The whole should be protected from the depredations of the parts. The Labour Party was not doing what it should to insulate the general interest from the warlords and the bandits. In 1979, after 17 years as a member and almost 50 years as a collaborator, Meade resigned in protest from the Fabian Society. He told its general secretary that he had to withdraw because of its embarrassing allegiance to overpowerful independent labor monopolies that respect neither law nor morality. I cannot support any body which averts its gaze from this awkward but fundamental reality. Letter from Meade to Diane Hayter dated 7 December 1979, MP 967. A socialist state is not a corporate state. Labor should be standing up to the unions who, inconveniently, were also its main source of funds. Meade knew that he would be called a union basher, and even a fascist beast, CPI 369, if he continued to call upon the government to preserve the liberal nature of the economy, CP 214. It was nonetheless his view that the concentrated power of labor even more than that of capital was standing in the way of justice and prosperity. 8.3 An agenda for reform. The first task is to revisit the existing regulations. The government should abrogate the Trade Disputes Act of 1906 and its sister legislation in order to restore a level playing field. The unions had been given immunity from civil and criminal liability. Their funds could not be attached. Strikes could not be prosecuted as a breach of contract. Privileges, exemptions and exceptional legal powers SWF 1L4 like these may have had a function at an earlier stage of British industrial relations. In the era of stagflation, Meade believed, it was no longer so. Restoring a level playing field would increase the bargaining power with which employers can resist excessive wage claims CPI 335. Business has lagged behind. Making the market more equal will rescue capital from the status of the residual claimant. No doubt, certain interventions, to produce a modified free trade position, BOP 326 would ensure that the employer's side did not prematurely capitulate. Free trade is always a threat to vested interest. Meade also recommended that an extended competition commission should monitor imperfections in the market for labor and not just for output. In the 1930s he was complaining that unions and professional bodies were restricting mobility and putting up pay EAP 96, 170. In the 1990s he was reflecting that the shortening of the working week, early retirement, artificial demarcations, redundancy packages that make new hires a potential time bomb and contrived discrimination that keeps out marginal minorities were the modern form of Luddite activity, Lee, 40. They were artificially limiting the supply of labor and artificially inflating the wage. There was also the pre-entry closed shop. Convinced that this was almost always an unneeded bottleneck, Meade invited the Competition Commission to conduct an unbiased review. It should do so with the impartial advice of outside experts who have in-depth knowledge of the trade or profession but do not themselves have a vested interest in the spurious credentialism of a self-regulating mystery, even doctors and lawyers are human, CPI, 334. Welfare policy as well as constricted entry can increase the power of the unions. Even in the Great Depression, income maintenance, on too generous a scale, EAP, 78, had augmented the pool of unemployment. Benefits encourage the employable to extend their search. They make the workers choosier about a new opportunity. Reinforced by Keynesian demand management and financed by a deficit, the workers are being guaranteed a seller's market. It is no more the market clearing quantity than it is the market clearing price. Public policy is making the very definition of full employment more nearly a range than a point. Permissive welfare improves the bargaining position of the unions. Because involuntary unemployment is less likely to trigger absolute poverty, the unions will have fewer compunctions about protecting their members at the expense of the out of luck. Income-related benefits, Meade wrote in 1944, tend to soften the incentive for the negotiators to gravitate to the equilibrium wage, so long as the unemployed and other persons in want are cared for by the state. Trade unions are tempted to pay more attention to the interests of their own members who are in work than to the desirability of finding extra employment for their own unemployed members or for other outsiders. CPI, 237. To clip the wings of the unions, it would be necessary to cut the replacement ratio. If benefits to the unemployed approach the previous earned income, the unions will not need to shade their claims lest the crowded out experience severe hardship on the dole. The unions have little or no regard, SWF, 89, for the verdict of supply and demand. Beveridge plus Keynes had seen to that. Meade's proposals for the liberalization of statute law, competition policy and social welfare are all intended to prevent the great stagflation from having things all its own way. Demand management will have to acknowledge that there is no such thing as a bottomless pit. Full employment cannot mean full employment at any wage that the imperfect competitors pluck out of the air. It can only mean the right to a job at a realistic wage that leaves as much and as good for others. Meade argues for realism in microeconomics, macroeconomics and social policy. There is, however, a further strand to his strategy. It is the self-policing morality of the citizen who knows his bounds. Unusual among economists, the individual to Meade is not just a free-floating monad but also an adequately socialized tribesman. The two are one. The social contract marches alongside the maximization of utility when the union stagflationist sets off to prey. Sometimes it is the good Dr. Jekyll and sometimes it is the bad Mr. Hyde. People are a mix. Conscience is an economic input. It fills a market void. Some unions are large and national. The whole country is adversely affected when the railwaymen and the doctors go on strike. Some unions are small but situated at a crucial node. Air traffic controllers at the commanding heights have the latent power to disrupt. Large or small, the unions can impose unwanted stagflation on their nation as a whole. It is a disaster waiting to happen. Or is it? What is striking is not how often they play out devil take the hindmost but how frequently they stay their hand. The unions do not necessarily do what they know they can. Gangs and tribes, Meade says, are a difficult moral issue. Meade 1981, 77. It is his contention that, large numbers or small numbers, unions in the real world are refraining from negative spillovers which would undermine an essential foundation for a decent society. This damage to the fabric of society may well be the most important aspect of the matter. Meade 1981, 78. It is not just the Marxian profit-takers but the shoppers, the pension funds and the wider working class that suffer the loss when the weak-willed abstain from their social duty. Meade never spells out why union negotiators should deviate from the textbook tenets of supply and demand. It may be the central value system in the sense of J.J. Rousseau, E. Durkheim and R. H. Tawney. It may also be a politically orchestrated social compact according to which society pays non-specific compensation to all its members and receives in return the voluntary gift of moderation and abstention. Society redistributes the life chances and the endowments. In exchange for its pro-labor concessions, the unions practice self-restraint and hold back. Wage cuts in themselves are neither politically acceptable nor morally justifiable. CP 3, 283. Pigou himself observed that it would be out of harmony with the moral sense of the time. Pigou 1927, 285 to cut low wages that have already touched their social nadir. What Meade would suggest is that consensus for the market clearing wage can nonetheless be purchased by a package deal. Progressive taxation levels down the differentials. Death duties level down the wealth. Tax exemptions for reinvestment turn profits into additional jobs. A national dividend gives every citizen a share in the we. It all contributes to another regarding consensus. Unions have power, which they have not fully exploited in the past. CPI 328. Writing in 1971, Meade was insisting that the unions had not fully exploited their power to do the best for their members. Exchange to be legitimate has also to be fair. Perceived organicism is the reason why good citizens do not drop litter, do not cheat their customers and do not go on strike. 8.4 Incomes policy, competition policy, full employment policy, state-led gift exchange and self-policing restraint might be enough to curb the excesses that were causing the stagflation. Where they are not, a government, post-Beveridge and post-Keynes, will have to choose between setting a lower target for the level of employment or imposing some form of compulsory wage regulation. CPI 256. Neither option has an intrinsic appeal. Competition is conducive to efficiency and employment contributes to growth. Engineered stagnation that restricts the quantities or authoritarian edicts that stifle the price are, however, only palliatives that put off the search for a cure. Neither is a plus-sum solution to what is in effect an institutional malfunction. Both are second best. An incomes policy, neither pure Keynesianism nor pure monetarism, Meade 1981-84, has the advantage over macroeconomic slack that it does not antagonize the unions or retard economic advance. It does not displace labor. An